"That's not my child." He said it quietly. That was the part I never forgot. Not a shout, not a wounded roar, just four flat words spoken in the same tone he used to ask whether I'd remembered to schedule the gutter cleaning. The kitchen smelled like the rosemary chicken I'd left in the oven too long, the edges going from gold to brown. Rain ticked against the tall window over the sink, and my husband stood across the marble island looking at the little black and white ultrasound photo in his hand as if it were a parking ticket. I had walked in 11 minutes earlier holding a gift bag. Inside it, wrapped in tissue, was a tiny pair of cotton socks and that photo. I was 41 years old, 11 weeks pregnant, and for the first time in 2 years, I had let myself feel something close to joy. He set the photo face down on the counter. He did it gently, the way you set down something you've already decided to throw away. "I want you out tonight," he said. There were two other people in that house who heard it, and neither of them moved to stop him. I'll tell you who they were soon, because their silence mattered more than his words. My name is Naomi Brandt. By the end of that February, the man standing in that kitchen would lose everything he had spent 15 years building. Not because I screamed, not because I begged, but because of one thing he had completely forgotten about me. He'd forgotten what I did for a living. By sunrise the next morning, I had already started counting. I slept in my car that night. I want to be honest about what that actually looked like, because people imagine something cinematic, and it wasn't. It was a 2018 sedan parked in the far corner of a grocery store lot off Folly Road, engine running every 20 minutes for the heat, because Charleston in February is mild until the sun goes down and then the damp gets into your bones and stays. I had my coat, my purse, a phone at 31%, and the gift bag on the passenger seat because I couldn't make myself put it in the trunk. The little socks were still inside it. I didn't cry for a long time. I've thought about why, and I think it's because crying is what you do when something surprises you, and somewhere underneath the shock, a much older and colder part of me was not surprised at all. Before I tell you what happened next, and I promise you, what happened next is the whole reason I'm telling you this, do me a small favor. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It helps me know how far this story travels. And honestly, on the nights I was sitting in that parking lot, knowing that strangers somewhere would one day understand would have meant everything to me. So, where was I? By midnight, I had done the arithmetic, because arithmetic is the thing I reach for the way other people reach for a drink. I had $410 in a personal checking account I'd kept open out of habit. Our real money, the savings, the investment accounts, the cash reserve, was managed by my husband, because managing money was, in the most literal sense, his profession. My health insurance ran through his firm. My laptop was on the desk in the study, and the keys in my hand opened a front door that, I would learn the next morning, had already been rekeyed at 10:40 that night by an emergency locksmith my husband called the moment my taillights left the driveway. He was efficient. I'll give him that. But here's the thing he did not know, sitting warm in our house while I sat cold in that lot. For 11 years, I had worked as a forensic accountant. I spent my days reconstructing money that other people had tried very hard to hide. Embezzlement. Fraudulent transfers. Shell companies layered like onions to make a dollar disappear and reappear somewhere it didn't belong. I had testified in federal court 4 times. I had a particular reputation among the small circle of people who hire forensic accountants for being patient and quiet and absolutely relentless. And as I sat in that car, one detail kept surfacing, the way a splinter works its way up through skin. For about 5 months, my husband had been asking me, casually, about my first marriage, about a man named Julian. He'd never cared about Julian before. Suddenly, he cared a great deal. I didn't have the answer yet, but I had the question. And in my line of work, the question is where everything starts. Let me back up, because you need to understand who these people were to me. I grew up in Beaufort, an hour south of Charleston, the daughter of a high school math teacher and a woman who balanced the books for 3 small businesses out of our dining room. We were not poor and we were not comfortable. We were precise. My mother taught me that a ledger is a kind of confession, that no matter what people say about themselves, their money tells the truth. I believed her then. I believe her more now. I married young the first time. Julian Mercer. I was 26. He was 30, and he was the most decent man I have ever known. He was a water engineer, obsessed, genuinely obsessed with the problem of getting clean drinking water to places that didn't have it. We were married for 5 years. We weren't unhappy. We were just two people who slowly realized we loved each other more like siblings than like spouses, and we had the rare good sense to admit it before resentment set in. We divorced kindly. There was no other person, no money fight, no slammed doors. He gave me a small brass compass the day the papers were signed, engraved on the back with 2 words, True North. "So you always know which way you're pointed," he said. I kept it in my desk drawer for 16 years. It mattered later. Keep it in mind. Julian moved to San Diego and poured himself into his work. We exchanged a Christmas card for a few years. Then even that faded. The last I'd heard, around 2014, his desalination company was doing well. I was happy for him in the distant way you're happy for someone who used to be your whole world and is now a name you smile at. Then I met Preston Vance. Preston was 42 when I married him, and he was everything Julian was not. Polished, magnetic. He ran a boutique wealth management firm called Vance Hollings Capital out of a restored building on Broad Street, the kind with 18-foot ceilings and original heart pine floors and a reception desk that cost more than my first car. He managed money for old Charleston families, the ones whose names are on the streets. He wore his confidence like a well-cut suit, and for a long time I found it reassuring. After Julian, after years of being single and careful, there was something steadying about a man who seemed so completely certain of the ground beneath his feet. We married in a garden on the Battery with the harbor behind us. I was 36. I thought I was building the second half of my life. I need to tell you about something now, and I'll only say it once, because it's the part that turns "that's not my child" from a cruel sentence into something I still don't have a clean word for. 2 years before that night in the kitchen, I had been pregnant before. We lost her at 22 weeks. Her name was going to be Ruth, after my grandmother. I won't dwell on it. There are some rooms you walk past with your eyes forward, but I will tell you that I held her, that she fit in 2 of my hands, and that Preston stood in the corner of the hospital room that day and did not come closer, and I told myself he was grieving in his own way. I told myself a great many things in those years. That's the part I'm least proud of and most honest about. So when I walked into that kitchen with a new ultrasound photo, 11 weeks along, terrified and hopeful in equal measure, I was not just announcing a pregnancy. I was offering him the one thing I thought no one on earth could throw back in my face. And he looked at it, and he said it wasn't his. A man does not say that by accident. A man says that when he needs it to be true. Hindsight is a forensic discipline. You go back through the record looking for the entry that didn't fit, the transaction that should have flagged. When I went back through the previous 14 months, the entries were everywhere. I'd seen every one of them in real time and explained every one away. Let me lay them out the way I'd lay out a case file, because the pattern only becomes a pattern when you stop looking at the items one at a time. Item 1. 14 months earlier, Preston started taking calls in the carriage house behind our home, the little converted building he used as a home office. Nothing strange about that, except he started closing the door and then he started locking it. One evening, I walked back to bring him a coffee and the handle didn't turn. He opened it a moment later, smiling, phone face down on the desk, and said it was a compliance call. Boring regulatory stuff you don't want to know. I'm a forensic accountant. I would have loved to know. I let it go. Item 2. The withdrawals. Small ones at first. $300 in cash, then 5, always on weekdays, always from accounts he assumed I never checked because he handled the money. I check everything. It's a compulsion and a profession. But these were our accounts, and I trusted my husband, so I filed them under Preston being Preston and didn't pull the thread. I want you to remember that, because the whole story is about what happens when a person who pulls threads for a living decides, for once, to trust instead. Item 3. The dinner in October. We were at a client event, a charity thing at the Gibbs Museum, oysters and a string quartet, and a man Preston worked with, a little drunk, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Vance is going to land on his feet. He always does, even after—" And Preston laughed too loudly and steered him toward the bar before the sentence finished. "After what?" I asked Preston in the car. "After the market correction," he said smoothly. "Everyone's nervous." I nodded. I let it go. There's a theme here. I was very good at letting it go. Item 4. This is the one I should have caught, and the fact that I didn't still sits in my chest some mornings. Around the same time the carriage house calls started, Preston began asking about Julian. The first time, it was a joke at a party. Naomi's first husband was some kind of genius. Did you know that? The second time, it was over breakfast. Idle. Whatever happened to the water guy? Did he ever sell that company? The third time, it was a question wearing a costume. He asked whether I'd kept in touch with anyone from before, and when I said no, not really, he asked specifically, not even Julian? And watched my face when I answered, 3 times in 2 months, about a man I hadn't spoken to in years. A man who, it turned out, had information attached to his name that was worth, and I'll tell you the exact figure when I tell you how I learned it, quite a lot of money. Item 5. The catalyst, though I didn't recognize it as one. 3 weeks before that night in the kitchen, I came home and found Preston in the study with the door open and his sister Vivian sitting across the desk from him, and the two of them stopped talking the instant they heard me on the stairs. Not paused. Stopped. The way you stop when the conversation is the kind that can't have a witness. I need to introduce Vivian properly, because she is the second person who stood in that kitchen and said nothing, and she is, in many ways, the real architect of what happened to me. Vivian Vance was Preston's older sister, 46, and an estate and probate attorney with a firm in Columbia. She was brilliant, frankly. Cool, articulate, beautifully dressed, with a way of complimenting you that left you feeling slightly smaller afterward without ever being able to point to why. She had never approved of me. She showed it in the way she'd ask about my work. Forensic accounting, that's like a detective but for spreadsheets. With a little laugh, every single time, as if it were fresh. She and Preston were unusually close. They finished each other's sentences, and she had spent her entire career in the one corner of the law where a person learns, professionally and early, exactly how to find out whether a wealthy man has died and exactly what he left behind, and to whom. That was the room. That was the configuration. A husband whose money was quietly bleeding somewhere I couldn't see. A sister who lived inside the machinery of inheritance, and a wife they had both decided, for reasons I didn't yet understand, needed to be gone before something arrived. The pregnancy didn't cause it. The pregnancy accelerated it. That's the difference. And it's the difference that saved me, because a plan executed in a hurry leaves fingerprints. And I have spent my whole career lifting fingerprints off money. The morning after I slept in the car, I drove to a diner on Savannah Highway at 6 and ordered eggs I didn't eat and coffee I drank too much of. I sat in the booth and did the thing I do best. I stopped feeling, just for an hour, and started organizing. I made a list on a paper napkin. I still have the napkin. 1. Get back into the house and retrieve what was legally mine before he could claim I'd abandoned it. My passport, my social security card, my personal laptop, and this was the item that mattered most, though I underlined it without yet knowing why, the external drive in my desk drawer where I kept encrypted backups of everything, including, as it happened, copies of certain household and business records I'd archived over the years out of pure professional habit. I back up everything. People with my job do. 2. A lawyer. Not for the divorce, not yet. For the money. I needed to know, before I did anything else, what Preston could and couldn't legally do to our joint assets, and how fast. 3. I needed to understand why my husband had spent 5 months asking about Julian. I called Marguerite Tran at 7:02. Margot was a family law attorney I'd met 3 years earlier when I'd been retained as a financial expert on one of her divorce cases, a doctor whose husband had hidden $2 million in a fake consulting company. We'd taken him apart together. She'd told me afterward, over bad wine, "If I'm ever the one getting divorced, Naomi, you're my first phone call." I'd laughed. I wasn't laughing now. She texted back in 9 minutes. "Come at 8:30. Bring everything you have access to. Don't touch the joint accounts and don't post anything anywhere." Margot's office was on Meeting Street, and her assistant brought me coffee I didn't need and a glass of water I did, and Margot herself came in wearing reading glasses and an expression I recognized, the calm of someone who has heard every terrible thing a family can do and has stopped being shocked by any of it. "Tell me from the beginning," she said. "Don't summarize." "I'll tell you what matters," I told her. It took 26 minutes. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she set down her pen. First, she said, check the joint accounts right now. On your phone, not his computer. Do it while I watch. I logged in. We held a $30,000 cash reserve in a joint money market account. I knew that number cold. I'd reconciled it the previous month. The balance was $81. I set the phone down. My hand was completely steady, which surprised me, and Margot noticed it was steady, and I watched her file that away about me. When? She asked. I checked the transaction log. 3 transfers, timestamps between 11:14 p.m. and 11:31 p.m. the night before. Roughly half an hour after he'd put me out and rekeyed the doors. The money had gone to an account I didn't recognize, under an entity I didn't recognize, a limited liability company called Sapello Holdings. That, Margot said, and her voice didn't change at all, which is how I knew it was serious, is marital asset dissipation, and it just made our morning a great deal easier. We can move for an emergency restraining order on further transfers today. She wrote Sapello Holdings on her pad and circled it twice. Now. Tell me about the first husband. So I told her about Julian, and about the 5 months of questions, and about Vivian stopping mid-sentence on the stairs. Margot took off her glasses. Naomi, she said slowly, you understand what you're describing. You investigate this for a living. You're describing a man who learned something about your ex-husband's estate and decided to remove you from his life before something happened that would entitle you to it. I know what I'm describing, I said. I needed someone else to say it out loud. Then say this back to me, she said. What's the first thing you'd do on a case like this if it weren't your own? And I heard myself answer in the flat, certain voice I use on the witness stand. Find out if the dead man left a will, find out if I'm in it, and find out who else already knows. Margot almost smiled. Go find out, she said. And Naomi, document everything. Every text, every call log, every screenshot to a personal email account he's never seen. Starting this second. I had an old personal email from before the marriage that Preston didn't know existed. I'd kept it the way I keep the compass, the way I back up drives, out of a habit of never fully closing any door. That habit was about to become the most valuable thing I owned. I found Julian's sister on the second try. Her name was Delia, and she'd always been warm to me, and her face on a social media profile was older but unmistakably hers. I sent a short, careful message that I was Naomi, that I hoped she was well, and that I had reason to think I might need to speak with someone about Julian's affairs. She called me 40 minutes later, and the first thing she said, in a voice gone soft and strange, was, "Oh, Naomi, you don't know. Julian had died in October, a heart attack, at 51, alone in his office in San Diego on a Sunday. The water company he'd built had been acquired 4 years earlier by a multinational, in a deal whose terms were never made public. He had never remarried. He had no children. His lawyers have been trying to reach you for months," Delia said. There's a letter. Naomi, you should call his attorney. His name is Walter Boone. I'll text you the number. Funshi de Saus del Manchi en Stelle. She paused. He talked about you, you know. Near the end, he said you were the only person who was ever in his life because of who he was and not what he had. I sat in the parking garage with the phone against my ear and the late morning light coming through the concrete openings in pale gray bars, and I felt the entire shape of my situation rotate, the way a structure does in the instant before you understand it isn't standing the way you thought. Julian had died in October. Preston had started asking about him 5 months earlier, in the spring, before Julian was even dead, which meant Preston hadn't found out about an inheritance. He'd found out about Julian's wealth, and then he'd been waiting, watching a sick man, or a vulnerable one, the way a patient man watches a market position he intends to exploit. I called Walter Boone's office in San Diego. His assistant put me on hold for 4 minutes. When he came on the line, his voice carried the particular relief of a man who has been holding a door open for a long time, not knowing if anyone would ever walk through it. "Ms. Brandt," he said, "I am very glad to hear from you. I represent the estate of Julian Mercer, and you are named in it. I'm afraid the matter is rather substantial." "How substantial?" I asked. "The personal bequest to you," he said, "is $94 million. And there is a condition attached. But Ms. Brandt, before we discuss any of that, there's a letter he asked me to read to you, in his own words, the first time we spoke." May I?" And that was the moment I broke. I want to be honest about that too, because it was the only time in this whole story that I did. I sat in a concrete parking garage in downtown Charleston with $81 in my joint account and a pair of cotton socks in a gift bag on my passenger seat, and a stranger read me the words of a man I had divorced 16 years earlier and never stopped respecting. And I put my hand over my mouth and I cried. Once, hard, for about 90 seconds. For Julian, and for the daughter I'd held in two hands, and for the version of myself who'd kept saying let it go for so long that she'd almost let go of everything. Then I wiped my face with a CVS napkin, and I stopped, and I started counting again. The letter said, in part, and I'll paraphrase it because the rest is mine to keep, that Julian had spent his life learning that water always finds the lowest place and pools there, and that he'd come to believe people do the same, that everyone eventually settles to the level of their truest nature. He said he'd watched me for the 5 years of our marriage settle, again and again, to a level of plain decency, and that it had taught him what he wanted his money to do after he was gone. He said he was leaving the bulk of his fortune, over $300 million, to a charitable foundation for clean water infrastructure, and that the condition of my personal bequest was simple. He wanted me to chair that foundation, not manage it from a distance. Chair it, make the decisions, decide where the water went. He believed, Walter Boone said, that you would point it true north. His words, not mine. True north. I thought about a brass compass in a desk drawer 11 minutes from where I sat, in a house I'd been locked out of by a man who had said the child inside me wasn't his. "Mr. Boone," I said, "I need to tell you something, and then I'm going to need your help." My current husband may have known about Julian's estate before I did. I think he may have been planning around it for months. And I need every document, every date, every disclosure record you can lawfully give me. There was a long pause. "Ms. Brandt," Walter Boone said carefully, "is there any chance someone made an unauthorized inquiry into this estate? Because I will tell you, we had a contact in November from an attorney in South Carolina claiming to represent a potential creditor of the estate, requesting confirmation of the existence and value of the trust. We declined to provide it, but the inquiry was logged, as all inquiries are." My mother used to say a ledger is a confession. Was the inquiring attorney's name, I asked, Vivian Vance? The pause this time was the kind that answers the question before the words do. "I'm not able to confirm a name over the phone," Walter Boone said. "But I would strongly encourage your attorney to request our inquiry log through formal channels. I think you'll find it illuminating. And your to your swanand." I hung up and sat very still in the gray light, and I did not cry, and I did not shake. I felt instead the thing I feel right before I open a set of books I already know are cooked. A kind of cold, clean focus. A settling. Here is where I'll ask you for one more thing, because we've reached the part of the story I think about most. If you want to know what I found in those books, what Sapilo Holdings actually was, and what my husband had really been hiding, and why an estate attorney would risk her license to make a phone call to San Diego, then make sure you've subscribed before you go any further. Because what I uncovered over the next 3 weeks didn't just end my marriage. It ended Preston Vance's career, and it nearly ended his freedom. People think revenge is loud. In my experience, revenge is paperwork. For the next 3 weeks, I lived in the guest room of a woman named Ruth Calloway, and I built a case. Let me tell you about Ruth, because she's the reason I survived the building of it. Ruth was 73, a retired family court judge, and she'd lived 2 doors down from the house I'd shared with Preston for the entire marriage. She'd watched me in the quiet way that wise old women watch, and she'd formed her own opinions and kept them to herself, the way a good judge does until the evidence is in front of her. When I called her from the parking garage, I don't entirely know why I called her, except that I needed an adult in the room, and my own mother had passed 4 years earlier. She said only, "Bring your things. The guest room has good light in the mornings." We'll figure out the rest at the kitchen table. Nasan shantramalma na naishaminal and makshan nasan. And we did. We figured out almost all of it at her kitchen table, under a hanging lamp, with cups of tea going cold and a legal pad between us. On the second morning, Ruth set a fresh mug in front of me and said, "You're going to want to do this fast. I understand the instinct. Don't." The thing about people like your husband is that they're built for sprints. They panic, they move, they cover. You win by going slow. You win by being the only patient person in the room. She tapped the table. I sat on the bench for 31 years. The ones who lost were always the ones in a hurry. So I went slow. Margot got the emergency restraining order on the marital accounts within 48 hours. A judge signed it on a Thursday afternoon, freezing everything Preston hadn't already moved and putting a litigation hold on the rest. She got a sheriff's deputy to accompany me back to the house to retrieve my personal property, because Preston could not legally bar me from my own belongings, even if he'd changed every lock in Charleston. I want to describe that visit because it's the first time I saw Vivian since the night in the kitchen. The house smelled like it always had. Beeswax polish and the faint salt that gets into everything within a mile of the harbor. Preston stood in the doorway of the study with his arms crossed, watching me carry out boxes with the deputy a respectful 3 feet behind me. He didn't speak. His face was doing arithmetic. I knew that face. I'd been married to it for years. And Vivian sat at the dining table with her hands folded and her eyes tracking every item I removed, the way an auditor watches inventory leave a warehouse. The external drive was exactly where I'd left it, in the back of my desk drawer. I picked it up along with the brass compass, and I felt the small, cool weight of both in my palm, and I put them in my coat pocket rather than the box. Some things you don't let out of your hand. At the door, Vivian spoke for the first time. "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be, Naomi," she said in a tone of warm regret. Preston was overwhelmed. People say terrible things when they're frightened. This can still be civilized. I looked at her. 46, flawless, a woman who had spent her career learning exactly which words made people sign exactly which papers. "What was he frightened of, Vivian?" I asked. A half second. A flicker, fast and controlled, gone almost before it arrived. The same flicker I've seen on the faces of men across a deposition table when I lay down the bank statement they thought no one would ever pull. "He's your husband," she said smoothly. "He's frightened of losing his family." "Of course," I said. And I left. In the car, I let myself smile for exactly 1 block, because she'd told me something. She'd told me she didn't yet know how much I knew. And in my profession, the most dangerous person at the table is the one whose information the other side has badly underestimated. That night, at Ruth's kitchen table, I plugged in the external drive. Now, here is the part the master plan turned on, and it's the part Preston had completely forgotten. I am a forensic accountant. For years, out of a habit so ingrained I barely noticed it, I had been keeping organized, encrypted backups of our household financial records. Not because I suspected him, because I cannot not keep records. It's who I am. Tax documents, account statements. The firm's publicly filed regulatory disclosures, which I'd archived going back years because I'd helped Preston understand them when we first married and never deleted the files. Years of data sitting in a drawer that he had no idea I possessed. I opened the firm's filings first. Vance Hollings Capital. And I read them the way I read everything, not for what they said, but for what they were carefully arranged to not say. It took me 4 nights. Sapello Holdings, the LLC where he dumped our $30,000 the night he put me out, wasn't a one-time hiding place. It was a recurring counterparty inside his own firm's books. Money flowed from client accounts into a fund Preston controlled, and from that fund, in irregular amounts, into Sapello. And Sapello did nothing. It produced nothing. It held nothing real. It was a drain disguised as a destination. I'd seen the pattern 100 times. It's the oldest one in the book, the one that brought down men far smarter than Preston. He was using new client money to cover withdrawals and losses in old client accounts, and skimming a slice through Sapello to maintain a life that the firm's actual performance could no longer support. The drunk man at the museum had nearly said it. Even after the losses, after the correction that had eaten the firm's real returns 18 months ago, the correction Preston had papered over rather than disclose, He wasn't just a cruel husband. He was running out of other people's money. And $94 million sitting one divorce away from his reach was the lifeline he'd been planning his exit around. That's why the pregnancy mattered. A child complicates a clean divorce. A child is a reason a wronged wife gets sympathy, support, time. He needed me gone fast, gone now, gone on terms that made me look unstable and faithless. That's not my child. Before Julian's estate settled and the world saw exactly how much the woman he'd discarded was worth. I sat back from the laptop. The lamp hummed. Somewhere outside, a marsh bird called once and went quiet. "You found it," Ruth said from the doorway. She wasn't asking. "I found it," I said. "What is it?" "It's a confession," I said. He just didn't know he was writing one. I did 3 things in the days that followed, and I did all of them slowly. The first was the hardest and the most important. I did nothing that I wasn't legally entitled to do. Every document I had lawfully. They were marital records, household files, publicly filed disclosures, my own backups. I did not hack anything. I did not steal anything. I am very precise about this, because the entire power of what I'd found depended on it being clean. The moment you cut a corner, you hand the other side a story about you instead of a story about them. Ruth, the retired judge, drilled that into me at the kitchen table until I could recite it. Clean hands, clean hands, clean hands. You don't beat a man like Preston by becoming him. You beat him by being the one thing he never bothered to be, careful. The second thing was that I built the financial reconstruction into a formal report, the kind I'd built dozens of times for federal cases, with exhibits and a transaction map and a clear narrative a juror could follow. I treated my own marriage like a client file. It was the strangest professional engagement of my life and the cleanest work I have ever done. The third thing was that I made one phone call I'd been avoiding to a man named David Okafor, who'd been a colleague of mine years earlier and who now worked as an examiner for a securities regulator. I didn't give him anything I shouldn't have. I asked him a hypothetical, the way professionals do, over coffee at a place on King Street. I described a pattern, anonymized, careful, and I asked him what a person would do if they encountered it. And David, who is a careful man too, looked at me for a long moment and said, "A person would file a tip through the proper channel and let the proper people pull the threads. And a person who'd already done the math would make that examiner's life very easy." Then he slid his card across the table. Whoever that person is. Meanwhile, Preston made his moves, right on schedule. Right on the schedule of a man who panics. First came the soft approach. Vivian called Ruth's house, a number I had never given her, which told me Preston had paid someone to find it, which told me they were spending money they didn't have to find me. She asked if she could come by, just to talk, woman to woman. I said yes, because refusing teaches you nothing, and agreeing teaches you everything. She arrived with a box of pralines from a shop on Market Street, which was so precisely calibrated to look harmless that I nearly admired it. She sat in Ruth's front room and declined tea and looked around the modest house with an expression of gentle cataloging, and she made her offer. Preston, she said, was devastated. Preston had panicked. Preston was willing to go to counseling, to start over, to be a father. All he asked was that I drop the financial litigation, accept a fair and quiet divorce settlement, designate Julian's inheritance as separate property, generously, she said, as if they were granting me the thing that was already mine, and sign a confidentiality agreement preventing me from discussing the circumstances of our separation with anyone, ever. There it was, the NDA, the tell. He doesn't want the money, I said. He wants my silence. He wants his family, Vivian said. Vivian, I said, and I kept my voice as warm as hers. Did you call Walter Boone's office in San Diego in November, claiming to represent a creditor of Julian Mercer's estate? The flicker, longer this time. A whole second of something moving behind a smooth face. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said. The inquiry was logged, I said gently. All inquiries are. It's the first thing they teach you in estate law, isn't it? That the record remembers everything. She stood. She picked up the pralines, picked them back up, which I have always found to be the most honest thing a person can do, taking back the gift the moment the mask slips. At the door, she turned. "You have no idea what you're walking into," she said, and the warmth was entirely gone now, replaced by something flat and dry and genuinely cold. "Preston has friends. So do I. Architects, judges, regulators. Charleston is small, Naomi. Smaller than you think. Be careful which buildings you decide to bring down. You might be standing in one of them." "Wansao. Thank you for the warning," I said. "I'll be sure to check the foundation." She left. After the door closed, I noticed my hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, or not only fear. It was the physical aftermath of holding still. Your body releases what your face refused to show. Ruth came in, took one look at me, and put the kettle on without a word. The threat against my professional license came 2 days later, by phone, from a man who wouldn't give his name. "Forensic accountants need a clean reputation," he said, in a voice trying very hard to sound casual. "Yours could get complicated. People could start asking questions about your work." "Trusty, I'm recording this call," I said. "South Carolina is a one-party consent state. Please keep talking." The line went dead. I called Margot. I called David. The threat to a professional license, made by an unidentified party at the apparent direction of an adverse party in active litigation, was, Margot's word, a gift. The metadata was logged by my carrier. She filed a harassment motion and a request to expand discovery, and the judge granted both. And the discovery she got back was the rope Preston had been quietly handing me all along, because the records confirmed everything my backups had suggested, and more. Preston's firm laptop showed he'd first searched Julian's name in the spring, months before Julian died. Vivian's phone records, subpoenaed over her firm's furious objection, showed a 17-minute call to Walter Boone's office in November and 11 calls to Preston in the 3 days before he threw me out. And an email from Preston's personal account to his sisters, sent the Thursday before the kitchen, contained one sentence that I have read more times than I'd like to admit. "Need her gone before SD settles. Talk tonight. Don't put anything in writing after this." He told her not to put anything in writing, in an email. I am a forensic accountant. I have spent 11 years marveling at the fact that the people most certain they're too clever to leave a record are the ones who always do. My mother was right. The money tells the truth. And so, it turns out, does the man who tells his sister to be careful what she puts in writing. I had it all. Every beam, every bolt, every load-bearing lie. And then I learned that in 3 weeks, Preston was going to stand up in front of every client and partner and investor he had left at the Vance Hollings annual client dinner at the Hibernian Hall on Meeting Street and announce a brand new fund. A new fund. New money. The kind of money a man uses to fill a hole he's been hiding. I looked at Ruth across the kitchen table. "He's going to try to raise money from a room full of people he's already robbed," I said. Ruth folded her hands the way she must have folded them on the bench for 31 years. "Then that," she said, "is the room. I'll tell you exactly what I wore, because it mattered, and because I want you to understand that this part was not an accident either. I wore a deep green dress, the color of harbor water in winter, and my grandmother's pearls, and flat shoes because I was 4 months pregnant and done pretending I wasn't. In my bag, I carried a single slim folder and a brass compass, and on my way out the door, Ruth straightened my collar and said, composed, not cold. There's a difference, and the room will feel it. Nai ens nanar olamite shined. Then she got into the car with me, because a retired judge of 31 years standing does not let a woman walk into a room like that alone, and neither does a friend. The Hibernian Hall glowed. Chandeliers, white tablecloths, 120 of Charleston's wealthiest people drinking good wine under a coffered ceiling. Preston had not invited me, obviously, but the dinner was a public, ticketed event for clients of Vance Hollings, and as it happened, Ruth Calloway had been a client of Vance Hollings for 19 years, a detail Preston had never connected to the quiet woman 2 doors down, and a detail that put 2 seats at table 11, entirely within our rights. Clean hands, even at the door. I saw the exact moment Preston spotted me. He was near the front, in a beautiful charcoal suit, mid-laugh with a silver-haired man I recognized as one of his oldest clients. His eyes moved across the room out of habit, found me, and stopped. The laugh stayed on his face for a second after the rest of him had gone still, which is the most frightened thing a confident man's face can do. Vivian was at his elbow within 30 seconds. I watched them confer. I watched her hand find his arm. I watched him decide, visibly, to proceed. Because what else could he do, with 120 clients seated and waiting and the new fund to sell? He took the small stage. He thanked everyone. He spoke, smoothly and well, about resilience and stewardship and the long view, about how the past 18 months had tested the markets, but that disciplined management, his phrase, had protected what mattered. And then he began to introduce the new opportunity, the new fund. I stood up. I didn't shout. I want to be clear about that, for anyone imagining a scene. I simply stood, at table 11, in my green dress, with my hand resting on the swell of my stomach, and the room turned toward the movement the way rooms do. And Preston saw me standing, and the next sentence died in his throat. "Before everyone commits any money tonight," I said, and my voice carried because the room had gone quiet enough to hear it. "I think you should know what happened to the last of it." A murmur. Preston recovered fast, the way he always did. "Naomi," he said warmly, performing for the room, "this isn't the place. You're clearly not well. Everyone, my wife and I are going through a difficult, estranged wife," I said, "and 4 months pregnant, since you've raised it. With your child, as the prenatal paternity test in the court file confirms. I have the page in Samulin on the nature and nakananagari in center imaniwanern on Mike's tanzariatri in Stamlain Makshan. But that's not why I'm standing." The room was electric now. 120 people who managed their money very carefully, hearing the word court file. I held up the slim folder. I did not open it. The not opening is the power. I learned that on the witness stand years ago. My name is Naomi Brandt. I'm a forensic accountant. I've testified in federal court 4 times about exactly the kind of thing I found when I looked at this firm's books. I let that land. There's an entity called Sapello Holdings. It's listed in this firm's records as a counterparty. It isn't one. It's a drain. Client money has been moving into Vance Hollings funds and out through Sapello, and the returns several of you have been shown for the last 18 months are not the returns this firm actually earned. New money has been covering old losses. That's the fund being announced tonight. That's what the new money is for. Nasawan arsan indalindas nashtind. "This is slander," Vivian said, on her feet now, sharp and clear. "She's an unstable, jilted woman with a financial motive, and not one word of this is—" "David," I said. A man stood up at table 4, David Okafor, in a gray suit, holding nothing in his hands because he didn't need to, the way real authority never does. "David Okafor," he said, and the room read his title from the way he said his own name. "I'm an examiner with the State Securities Division. My office received a formal tip 3 weeks ago, supported by documentation, regarding the matters Ms. Brandt has described. I want to be clear that Ms. Brandt provided that tip through proper channels and that an examination is underway. I'd ask that no one in this room enter into any new agreement with Vance Hollings Capital tonight. He paused and looked directly at Preston. "And Mr. Vance, I'd ask you not to leave Charleston." You could hear the room change temperature, chairs shifting. 120 people quietly understanding, all at once, that the man on the stage was not going to land on his feet this time. Preston tried to bluff. "These are baseless." He tried to negotiate. "Naomi, let's step outside, we can—" And then finally, he collapsed, the way they always do, into the only thing left, anger. "After everything I gave you," he said, low and shaking, forgetting the microphone was still live so that the whole room heard it. "You'd burn it all down? You are nothing when I—" "Preston," I said, and I waited until he stopped, because I'd been saving one sentence for 16 weeks, and I wanted the room to hear it clean. I didn't raise my voice. Ruth had been right. Composed, not cold, and the room felt the difference. You looked at a photograph of our child and decided it would be cheaper to call her a stranger than to lose what you'd stolen. You bet your whole life on the idea that I was too quiet to count. You should have remembered what I count for a living. And sao einchi er mai na mein mines. I picked up my bag. I rested my hand on my stomach. That's not your firm anymore, I said. And she was always your child. You just couldn't afford for her to be. I walked out. Ruth walked beside me. Behind us, 120 people sat in absolute silence. And somewhere in that silence, Preston Vance was still standing on a small stage with a microphone he'd forgotten to put down. 6 months later, my daughter was born on a Wednesday morning at 8 pounds and 1 ounce, with a head of dark hair and a furious, magnificent set of lungs. I named her Julia. Not for Julian exactly, and not only for him, but for the man who pointed his life toward decency, and for the idea that you can settle, again and again, to the level of your truest nature, and have it turn out to be the thing that saves you. She is 6 weeks old as I record this, asleep against my chest in a house I bought outright on Sullivan's Island, where the light comes off the water in the mornings and fills the kitchen, and where there is a brass compass on the windowsill above the sink that says True North on the back. Here's what happened to the rest of it. The state securities examination became a federal one. Sapello Holdings unwound exactly the way I'd mapped it, and the map I'd built, clean, lawful, careful, made the examiner's work, in David's words, embarrassingly easy. Preston pleaded to charges related to investor fraud rather than face a trial whose evidence he'd already seen in discovery. He is serving a sentence now, and Vance Hollings Capital no longer exists. Its clients were folded into firms that, one hopes, will treat their confessions more honestly. Vivian lost her license. An estate attorney who makes an unauthorized, deceptive inquiry into a dead man's trust to enrich her brother does not remain an estate attorney. The inquiry was, as I'd been promised, logged, and the record remembered everything. I'm told she's left South Carolina. I don't think about her often. The people who tried hardest to make me small take up remarkably little space in my life now. That's the part no one tells you about being underestimated by people you loved. When it's over, you get all that space back. The divorce settled, of course, on terms a court determined, rather than a man dictated. Julian's $94 million was confirmed as my separate property, untouched by any of it. I never signed an NDA. I never signed away a single word. And I took the chairmanship. The Mercer Foundation funds clean water infrastructure in places where the lowest places have pooled the longest. I spend my days now deciding where the water goes, which is the strangest and best second career a forensic accountant could ask for. Turns out the skill of tracing money to where it's hidden works just as well for tracing it to where it's needed. We've funded wells and filtration, and a scholarship in Julian's name for engineering students who can't afford to point themselves true north on their own. Ruth comes to dinner on Sundays. She holds Julia and tells her, in her old judge's voice, that she comes from patient women and that patience is not the same as weakness, and that the world will try to teach her otherwise, and that she should not believe it. Julia, 6 weeks old, makes very serious observations about the ceiling fan and offers no rebuttal. Delia, Julian's sister, visited in the spring. She brought photographs of years I never knew him in. Julian on a dock in a yellow jacket, squinting into the sun, a piece on his face I'd never seen on him when we were young, and figuring out we were the wrong two people for each other, and the right two friends. He used to say you were the most honest person he ever knew, she told me. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I tried to be, I said. I lost it for a while. I found it again in a parking lot. I think about that parking lot more than you'd expect. The cold engine cycling on and off, the $410, the gift bag I couldn't put in the trunk. If you'd shown me, that night, where I'd be sitting 6 months later, this house, this light, this sleeping weight against my chest, I'm not sure I'd have believed you. But I think some quiet, cold, counting part of me already knew. The same part that wouldn't put the socks in the trunk. The part that kept the compass for 16 years. The part that backs up every drive. That part wasn't weakness. I'd just been calling it that for so long I forgot it was the strongest thing about me. So let me tell you the only lesson I have, the one I'll give Julia when she's old enough to ask why her father isn't here. The people who try to diminish you are always betting on one thing, that you don't know your own worth and that you'll be too quiet to find out. Preston bet on my silence. Vivian bet on my isolation. They were both wrong, and they were wrong because quiet is not the same as powerless, and patience is not the same as surrender, and the woman who keeps the records is never, ever the woman you want to underestimate. Know your worth. Keep your hands clean. Document everything. Find your Ruth, the person who tells you to go slow when everyone else is telling you to panic. And whatever you do, never, ever sign away your own voice. Now I want to hear from you, because I really do read every comment. If you'd been sitting in that car that February night, $400, no key, no plan, what would you have done first? Tell me below. And tell me where you're watching from, because I still can't quite believe how far this has traveled. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if stories about quiet people discovering they were never as powerless as they were told resonate with you, subscribe and stay with me, because there's another one coming, and I think you'll want to be here for it. Thank you for listening, truly. You have no idea what it means that you stayed.